Well, I appreciate everybody being here. Looks like a nice little group we have. My name is Durant Ashmore, and I'm a Greenville County resident. I live on the Reedy River, about 7 miles over the county line. I'm a 7th generation Greenville County. My family, the Ashmores, were pioneers in Greenville County. And my mother's family, the Ballantines, came to the Dutch Fork area of South Carolina in 1767. And in 1840, the Ballantines moved into Lawrence County and lived here from 1840 to 1900. And my second, third, and fourth great grandparents are buried here in the county. You know, a little bit about my background and my history. I've got a nursery and landscaping business in Greenville. I'm a graduate of Greenville High School, Furman University. I've got a master's degree in landscape architecture from the University of Georgia. And I've also got a graduate minor degree in historic preservation. And I'm a little bit of a frustrated historic preservationist living in Greenville because they have a horrendous preservation ethic in Greenville. So all of my career, I've been doing landscaping for 40 years and have seldom had an opportunity for preservation work until all of a sudden I started realizing all these battlefields that are within 20, 30 miles of my house. All of these battlefields that are within 20 or 30 miles from right here. More battlefields within 50 miles of right here than anywhere in America. So that is an outstanding characteristic that Lawrence County has. It's a characteristic that you should be proud of, and I know you are, and that's why you're here. So many of these battlefields, and I've become a battlefield preservationist, but we have difficulty with locating so many of these battlefields. We know where absolutely some of them are, but there are others we don't know. And so I see this as a journey with all of us here rediscovering lost history, because there's so much that is here that we don't know exactly about. Now, at this point, I would like to introduce a Lawrence County resident who has discovered lost history. And that individual is Roy Christie. Roy, will you stand up, please? Roy Christie found Fort Lindley. Fort Lindley is a superb site here in the county. It was a fort, and it was a fort that was attacked on July the 15th, 1776 by 300 Cherokees and 300 Tories dressed as Cherokees. And it was defended by Major Jonathan Downs, who fortunately had a force of 600 men at that time, and it was fought off. So Fort Lindley is a significant battle site here in the county. And there are numerous other battle sites that we're looking to rediscover, like Hammond's Store. Significant events happened at Hammond's Store. Williams Fort, we know about where that was. But I'm counting on you to help me locate some of these locations. And please don't tell me you go around the curve over a hill and it's first road that used to be on the left. I need more than that. I need you to do the legwork and tell me that it's, 2/10 of a mile from this intersection, or it's right across the street from, 45, Highway 14, or what have you. I need y'all do a little legwork, and then we'll explore and find where these sites are. But when I'm at these battlefields and I see the conditions there, I have found the stories that lead to what happened. Now, many folks, they ask me, in your research, what have you found and how did you find it? Folks, I'm telling you, I don't do research. I go on the coattails of other folks who have done the research. I read. I've got about 50 books on the Revolutionary War, and I've read them, and I remember most of what I heard or read. But for the most part, I'm a historical storyteller, is what I do. And many of these stories I've heard are diametrically opposed to what I just read previously. So I will tell you when I've heard conflicting stories. And it's like, which story do you believe? Well, I usually believe the first one that I read. This must have been what happened. But there's, a lot of conflicting accounts, particularly when it comes to battle participants and casualties and things of that nature. And one thing that's really not helping is the fact that the British, every time they fought a battle, no matter how bad they got whipped, they won, if you ask them. So we have to, worry about that. But when I'm at these battlefields and I'm knowing the stories, but still, I ask myself, why? How did this come to be? What led to the forces that these men wanted to kill each other? And wanted to kill each other in very horrible ways. The Revolutionary War in Lawrence County was extremely brutal. It was a civil war, neighbor fighting neighbor. And also, the most gruesome and brutal massacre that ever occurred in the Revolutionary War happened right here. It happened at Hays Station. And we will examine what happened at Hays Station in detail. But Bloody Bill Cunningham came through and he killed Colonel Joseph Hays and 18 of his men after they had surrendered and had their hands tied behind their back. And Bloody Bill Cunningham hacked those men to pieces. And that happened maybe 20 miles or so from here. So there's a rich history of Revolutionary War activities here in Lawrence County. And what we're going to be talking about is your heritage. The heritage of Lawrence County Revolutionary War activities. It is a rich heritage. And it's something that I know that you are proud of. And I'm going to get into that a little bit right now with describing why. And I'm going to briefly go through the colonial history of South Carolina up until the first shots were fired in 1775. So to begin with the history of South Carolina, you have to begin with the Native American population. And the first 5 years of the Revolutionary War was all about the Native Americans here in the backcountry of South Carolina. You'll hear me refer to the backcountry a lot. Anything this side of Camden and Orangeburg was the backcountry, and that's how it was referred to at that time. So the Native American population, there were probably 20 small tribes along the coast. The biggest tribe along the coast was the Yamasee or Yamasee, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. So they were in the area around Charleston. Then the Catawbas were in the area around Camden up into North Carolina. Then the Cherokees were this side of the Broad River into western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee. They were the largest tribe. So we consider the 5 civilized tribes that were in the southeast. The Cherokees, the Catawbas, the Creeks, they were in Georgia and Florida, the Chickasaws, and the, can't remember, Choctaws. So they all started with C. And the first uh, contact with Europeans happened in 1524 when d'Aillon sailed into Winyah Bay. Now, it was horrible what happened between the Native Americans and the Europeans. The Native Americans and the Europeans, just two totally distinct cultures that had no basis for understanding. They did not understand how each other thought at all. And we all know that it was terrible what did happen to the Native population. I'm not an apologist. I mean, the Europeans did some horrendous things to the Native Americans. The Native Americans did some horrendous things to the Europeans. And it turned into just one series of retaliations after another. So you know, it was just getting even. When did it start? It did start when d'Aillon sailed into Winyah Bay, which is where Georgetown is, and he checked out the surrounding land and so forth. He checked out the area. He did decide that he would take 60 Native Americans as slaves and take them back to the Caribbean where the Spanish were. 2 years later, he came back and he wanted to start a colony. He had 600 settlers. They went into Winyah Bay and didn't really like the conditions there, so they sailed away 200 miles. We don't know if it's north or south. Excuse me. It was probably south, and it was probably to Sapelo Island in Georgia where he set up there. But of his 600 original settlers, 500 of them died, and he was there just a short time before he left. Then in 1540, Hernando de Soto came through up from Florida searching for a city of gold, and he came through the state of South Carolina. On his way through, he crossed the Mississippi River, he drowned in the Mississippi River, his men made it back. But the Spaniards really screwed everything up from there on out. There could not have been worse ambassadors for European culture than what the Spaniards did. Hernando de Soto coming through with his horses, the Native Americans, they'd never seen horses. They were, just amazed and frightened by these horses. They would take the horses to the villages. They would find where the corn had been stored for the wintertime. They would take their corn stores. They would feed the corn to the horses. They would leave the Native Americans, with no food for the wintertime. And also the introduction of diseases, in particular smallpox. Horrendous deaths and losses from the diseases. As 90% of the Native American population was wiped out due to smallpox and measles and mumps and things like that. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, they described it as the land of skull and bones. There were just dead bodies everywhere and nobody left to bury those bodies. That's how bad it was with the diseases. So, the Spaniards were unsuccessful in the colonization. 1670, the English found Charlestown Landing. We know about what happened there. 1712, the North and South Carolina was divided. 1750, there was the first Indian War. 1715, this is the Yamasee War. It was the first time that the Native American tribes had banded together to try to drive the settlers out. It's poorly documented. It was chaotic. The Cherokees actually came to the rescue of the settlers at that time. The Yamasee were about to wipe out Charlestown Landing. but the Cherokees were allies with the Englishmen at that time. The Creeks were involved, the Catawbas were involved. It became a widespread war all up and down the eastern seaboard, but finally the English forces were able to withstand the attacks, and the MC War was over. 1735, we have the Stono Rebellion. Now, this is a slave insurrection. This is the only time that we've really had a slave insurrection in South Carolina, but it was an event that the plantation owners never forgot and always were on the lookout for. So during the entire Revolutionary War, there was always the question of what was going on with the slave population. At 1775, when the war started, there were 180,000 Europeans in South Carolina. There were 90,000 slaves. There were 12,000 Cherokees. So that just gives you an idea of the proportions of these different entities that were involved during this time. So along the coast, you start to get the rich planters, the aristocracy, and they're starting their plantations, the rice plantations and so forth. There's still Indian deprivations. It was a two-way street with the Cherokees and the settlers. The Cherokees became very dependent upon the English trade goods. They liked pots and pans and hunting knives and muskets. Their whole way of life changed, so they were dependent on European trade. The Englishmen, during this time, were quite enamored with Cherokee deerskins. Tens of thousands of deerskins were leaving Cherokee country and hitting Charleston and going to England for their clothing. Also medicinal plants. So the primary trade that the Cherokees were doing was deerskins and medicinal plants for pots and pans and things of this nature. And everything went along quite well, except there were still Indian attacks, and there were still banditry in the backcountry. So 1755, that's when it became legal for Europeans to live here in Lawrence County. It was the Treaty of Saluteth that was signed in 1755. The Native Americans wanted to stop English encroachment on their lands. The English said, okay, we're not going to encroach on your lands. They actually passed a law in 1739 that said it's illegal for a person of European heritage to go into Cherokee land. If you'll show the blue map, please. So at that point, it became legal for settlers to live here in Lawrence County, and the agreement was that the four current westernmost counties in South Carolina would be designated as Cherokee land, and that settlers could come into this area, and that the government in Charleston would give an annual allotment of shot and powder to the Cherokees so that they continue and they could kill the deer, could harvest the deer skins, and the trade would continue. The settlers, the aristocracy along the coast, they wanted increased settlement in the backcountry. They liked the fact that people were moving here into modern Lawrence County because that was a screen, that was a shield between the wild Native Americans and the more civilized area along the coast. But the problem was they never defined where Indian territory was. And the area right around here referred to as the Long Canes area, which is close to Abbeville. The Long Canes area was a rich agricultural site. Anywhere that river cane in the southeast grew, corn would grow. There were hundreds of thousands of acres of river cane. There's hardly any of it left now because it's prime area for raising corn, and that's why the Long Canes area became so popular. But the Cherokees felt like that was their territory, and they resented the white settlement that was in there. Then we have the French and Indian War, 1753, 1754 to 1761. Now, if there's ever an indication of how the European mindset and the Native American mindset conflicted with each other, it was exemplified in what happened in the French and Indian War. So what was happening, Spain was threatening the English colonies from the Florida area. France was threatening the English colonies all up and down the Mississippi. The English decided that they were going to build forts in Cherokee territory to thwart the French threat and also to regulate the trading that was going on. So they built a fort in Fort Prince George in Kiowa, which is an Indian trading town. If you'll show them. So Kiowa is up in this area here in Oconee County. 96 was in this area here. This is a map of the rivers of South Carolina, and the rivers of South Carolina played a very important role in what happened in the Revolutionary War. And I went to a lecture last week that Dennis Chastain gave. He describes the Cherokee Path, which is the trading route that the Cherokees used to go from Kiowa through 96, the south side of the Saluteth River, the south side of the Broad River, the Congaree, the south side of the Santee River, and then through down to Charleston, actually, this way. So there's Charleston. And you see this Cherokee Path does not cross any of the major rivers in South Carolina. You can go back to that now. So this was the trading route. French and Indian, there was a French threat to the English settlements. One particularly strong threat was at Fort Duquesne, which is present-day Pittsburgh. That's where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers came together and formed the Ohio River. That's where Three Rivers Stadium is now, is where Fort Duquesne was. That fort controlled the Allegheny and the Monongahela and the Ohio River. Controlled three rivers right there. So the George Washington and the British forces wanted to take Fort Duquesne. They had Cherokees leading the way. They had Cherokees that were led by Captain Richard Paris. And Richard Paris was the first man of European descent to live in Greenville County. Now, he was there illegally, but he was leading this force of Cherokees to attack Fort Duquesne. The Cherokees saw, the Frenchmen saw the Cherokees surrounding the hills over Fort Duquesne, and they realized that it was indefensible. Because while it controlled the rivers, from the landward side it was very vulnerable. So the French abandoned Fort Duquesne, and the Cherokees and Richard Paris were the first British allies to be in that fort. Now, during this time, again, conflicting stories, but the governor of Virginia promised the Cherokees that they would be well compensated for their activities in the French and Indian War. I don't know what it is about the governor of Virginia, but and I don't know if it's the same guy or not. But there was promise after promise made by the governor of Virginia that just never were kept. And one of these promises that wasn't kept was, compensation to the Cherokees for the sacrifices they made in the French and Indian War. And to explain the Cherokee way of thinking, it's important to know the clan culture of the Cherokees. This is how the Cherokees regulated their society for hundreds of years. There were 7 clans in the Cherokee Nation. The Deer Clan, the Blue Clan, the Paint Clan, the Bird Clan. There were 7 of them. The Cherokees were a matrilineal society. That means that the mothers, raised the families. Fathers did not raise their sons. Now, how does that compare to the European way of thinking? Fathers did not raise their sons. Sons were raised by their uncles because the uncles were of the same clan. The Cherokee women chose their husbands, and at any point they got tired of their husbands. All they had to do was just hit the road, Jack, and that was it. And that was the divorce. But it didn't matter because the uncles were raising the children, and so that they would be in that clan. This is how the clans regulated themselves. There was 2 clans that the woman could not choose her husband from, and that was her own clan or her father's clan. And what this did was it absolutely prevented incest. So Cherokees at that time knew that marrying your first cousin was not a good thing. That's what this clan system set up. And there are other ways that the clan system was regulated society. There were few laws. There were no laws against stealing because it was a communal system. Everybody owned everything. Until horses came into the picture, there wasn't personal property. So that wasn't a problem. Murder, they dealt with murder. If somebody from the Paint clan killed somebody from the Bird clan, then it was up to the Paint clan to rectify that murder. So the Paint clan could kill the murderer, or it could kill another of equal rank. And if that was done, things balanced out because the Cherokees were very concerned about balance. So this is how they balanced things out. However, if the fella from the clan that did the murdering left and he went down to Florida or whatever, he left knowing that one of his fellow clansmen was going to get killed in his place. If it was the duty of the offending clan to rectify the damage that was done, and if that clan did not, then the opposing clan, it was justified for them to kill anybody they wanted from that offending clan. So that's the way it happened. So here's the Cherokees. They're up in Virginia. And one story says they had their horses stolen. There's another story says that they weren't given the food that they were promised, so they ate their horses. But in any case, all of a sudden the Cherokees are up in Virginia and they find themselves without their horses. So what do? They come across the field and there's a bunch of horses there, so they get those horses. They were just, loose. And at first, when their horses were stolen, or whatever happened, they started asking the English settlers, who stole our horses? We don't know. And they were like, what clan stole our horses? And the English settlers are like, clan? We ain't got no clan. We're all one clan. Well, that was the wrong thing to say. Because the Cherokees, all of a sudden, they're all the same clan, so it doesn't matter what horses, they owe us horses, we'll take these horses. So they got 30 horses and they start going down through North Carolina. And I'm telling you, the folks in North Carolina do not like horse thieves. So they started killing the Cherokees, hanging the Cherokees. And the Cherokees are killing North Carolina settlers. So they're fighting all the way back, and the Cherokees come back to South Carolina. The British governor goes to the Cherokees and say, look, you killed 22 settlers in North Carolina. You owe us 22 braves for us to hang. Now, throughout this whole story, the number 22 takes on significance. And I don't even know if it's a true story or not. But so the British government says, we're going to totally cut off trade with you until you produce 22 braves for us to hang. And the Cherokees, after a while, the trade was cut off and they were becoming destitute. So they thought they would send a peace delegation down to Charleston and talk with the governor. And they send about 25 or 30 of their leading men to Charleston to talk with the governor. And the governor says, no, you've got to give us 22 men. And so the Cherokees said, okay, well, we failed, we'll go back home. And so the governor gave them an escort to go back to Kiowa town. Well, about halfway through on that escort, they decide they're going to arrest those chiefs, hold them hostage until the 22 braves are produced. And they take these folks up to Fort Prince George, which is directly across from the Kiowa village. And they put the Cherokee chiefs, about 30 of them, in a room designed for 6 people, and they keep them there as hostages. So there's a standoff for a little while, and the Cherokees sent a message into the fort saying that they wanted to talk. So Lieutenant Coitmore, who is the commander of the fort, he comes out of the fort. And when he comes out on the banks of the Kiowa River, the Cherokee braves, they rise up and they kill Lieutenant Coitmore. And he was there under a white flag of truce. And they killed him. So what happens then? All the hostages that are in Fort Prince George, they immediately get killed. And the war is on. This is the Anglo-Cherokee War, the Cherokee War of 1758 to 1761. During that time, the Cherokees were on the warpath. Now, it was established, this border right here, that became a defining line. Now, this is the border today between Lawrence County and Greenville County, and between Abbeville County and Anderson County. That was established in the Treaty of Augusta in 1763. That line was established. But when the Cherokees went on the warpath in 1758, all the settlers in the backcountry here started building forts, blockhouses, protection. There were 10 or so here in Lawrence County. There were others in Spartanburg County. these forts became future forts in the Revolutionary War, which happened about 15 years later. But Fort Lindley was a blockhouse, Hays Station was a blockhouse, just fort after fort after fort for settlers' protection. The British sent a force of an army under Alexander Montgomery into Cherokee territory to chastise the Cherokees because they had started the war in the British mind with the Cherokees. So the force came through. It rescued the garrison that was there at Fort Prince George. Now the British had also created another fort, Fort Loudoun in Tennessee, that was very much on the edge of where the French were encroaching upon Cherokee territory. So Fort Loudoun was put there for Cherokee trade, but also to keep the French at bay. So this army leaves Fort Prince George. They're heading towards Fort Loudoun. The mountains get steeper and steeper. The force is up near Franklin, North Carolina, at a place called Ochoe, steep banks, and the Indians attack and defeat the force under Alexander Montgomery. He declares victory and he leaves. Fort Loudoun, in the meantime, is left to themselves. 300 men at Fort Loudoun, surrounded by the Cherokees, hostile Cherokees. And they're totally to themselves. So finally, there was a negotiation, and the garrison at Fort Loudoun was told that if they gave up their weapons, they could march out of Cherokee territory back to Charleston. So that was the agreement. So the garrison at Fort Loudoun left. They're marching along. The Cherokees come into the fort. They found shot and gunpowder and munitions buried in the floor of the fort. So to their mind, the British had negated the truce that had been arranged. One story says 22 settlers or garrisonmen from Fort Loudoun were killed. Another story says the entire 300 men were killed. The commander of the fort, they scalped him alive. They made him dance till he died, and then they stuffed dirt in his mouth. If you're so hungry for land, have all you can eat. So that's just one of numerous atrocities that were committed by the Cherokees during that time. So the expedition under Alexander Montgomery was not successful. The Cherokees were still, on the warpath. The Long Canes Massacre happened about this time. John C. Calhoun's grandmother, Catherine Calhoun, and 23 other settlers were trying to escape a raiding party. They got stuck in the mud near Troy, South Carolina, and they were massacred. So the Long Canes Massacre happened, during this time as well. The British raised another force under James Grant to go and chastise the Indians. Now, it's important to know what the Revolutionary War future generals did during this time of the French and Indian War. Many of the leading patriots participated in these battles, and they sort of cut their teeth in military operations during the French and Indian War. And I'm particularly talking about the three greatest militia generals that the state of South Carolina was able to produce, and this is Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens. We're going to be hearing these names a lot throughout this series of lectures. These men cut their teeth fighting the Indians. They learned Indian fighting techniques. The British knew all about set-piece battles, but when it came to fighting Indians, they weren't that effective. So to a certain extent, some of the Revolutionary War activities were a continuation of activities that happened during the French and Indian War. Well, James Grant took his force of 2,000 or 3,000 men throughout Cherokee territory, and he chastised them. It was total annihilation. Burn all the villages, shoot all the cows and the pigs and the horses, and burn all the fields, and drive the Cherokees deep into the mountains with no clothes on their back was it, no supplies, no preparations for the winter. So the Cherokees sued for peace after that in 1761. The Anglo-Cherokee War is one name. The first Cherokee War is a second name. So things settle down a little bit as far as the Indians are concerned. At this time, other settlers start coming in from Pennsylvania and so forth into the backcountry. We're moving west from other places settled in South Carolina. And it became a wild time. There was no government in the backcountry of South Carolina. If you had a grievance, if your neighbor stole your horse, you had to go down to Charleston, file a complaint, and sooner or later somebody may come up there looking for, the fellow who stole your horse. I mean, it took 2 weeks to go to Charleston and back. If you sold land, if you bought land, you had to go to Charleston and get this taken care of. Well, that was a real pain for the settlers back here, but it was something that everybody in America knew that there was no law in the backcountry of South Carolina. Now, there were some wonderful people who were settlers and pioneers, but there were some bad people too. If you killed somebody in Pennsylvania and you wanted to escape from that, you came to the backcountry of South Carolina. The Cherokees were continuing with their deprivations, but if the Creeks decided they wanted to steal a few horses, they came up from Georgia and stole their horses. 30 Shawnees came down from their area into a raiding party into the backcountry of South Carolina. Anytime any Native American committed any depredation, who got blamed for that? It was the Cherokees. They always got blamed for that. And then you have the bandits that were in the backcountry. And you had the people who wanted law and order. So what happened was a movement arose to establish law and order. And this was the Regulator Movement. And if they suspected somebody of stealing horses, well, they'd tie the guy up and they'd whip him as many times as they thought. If they thought somebody committed murder, well, they'd hang that guy. If somebody did a bunch of stealing, they might tie 3 or 4 or 5 prisoners together and march them down to Charleston for justice there, but they might just as easy take care of justice on their own in the backcountry. So the Regulators Movement in the backcountry of South Carolina, in this area here, that is the future 96th district, that became governed by the Regulators. It was a vigilante group. But what happens when you have vigilantes? They take it too far. They always take it too far. And the Regulators took their movement so far that a counter movement rose up in opposition to them. And this counter movement was the Moderators. So you had the Regulators and the Moderators at odds with each other. And they actually formed camps and opposed each other around the banks of the Saluteth River and almost came to blows. Except that a fellow from the Camden district and a fellow from the Orangeburg district, Colonel Richard Richardson. Now, you'll be hearing this name. And a lot of the names that I'm discussing tonight, you're going to be hearing over and over again. Colonel Richard Richardson, who was head of the Camden Militia, he came to the banks of the Saluda. Major Danger Thompson, he got that name in the Anglo-English Cherokee War. So Richard Richardson, his second in command was William Danger Thompson. They talked to these two groups on the banks of the Saluda, and through the force of their will, that's what it says, the force of their will, they mollified the crowd, and everybody made nice and went home. But in the meantime, the royal government realized that they had a problem. So they established the 96th district. And that's this district here, with the courthouse being in 96. 96 was the most bustling place in the backcountry of South Carolina. It had 12 houses. But they did have a courthouse, and as a result of having a courthouse, they built the grandest structure in the backcountry. It was 3 stories tall. It was made out of brick. People came from miles and miles to see it. It was the jail. And there are lots of stories I'm going to be telling you about that 96 jail. But the Regulators movement was successful. It got the 96th district established. It got a court system in the backcountry, so it made it a lot easier to take care of business. As a result of having a courthouse, justices of the peace were appointed. And this is how the royal government operated. There were not a lot of British citizens in South Carolina pre-Revolutionary War. In fact, there was really only 2 of them. The governor, William Campbell, and the attorney general were English citizens who were sent by the royal government to govern South Carolina. And then they started appointing people to fill these various positions. Of course, they appointed their friends. And if you were in the population and you didn't like that justice of the peace, you couldn't vote him out of office. You were stuck with him. You had to deal with that. So this was one of their complaints that they had. And apparently, being a justice of the peace was a very lucrative job because all of these folks were quite wealthy. And a couple of the justices of the peace that did so well was the wealthiest man in present-day Lawrence County, which is Patrick Cunningham, which we're going to be talking about, and also James Lindley. We're going to be talking about that as well. And that's Lindley's fort that Roy discovered after it was lost for 200 years. So in the backcountry, what was desired was government. And what was desired was the primary function of government, which was security. That was the overriding concern of the folks in the backcountry. Protection, security, protection primarily from the Cherokees. And this is what dictated their thinking for most of this time. When the French and Indian War was over, the British took all of their soldiers out of South Carolina. There wasn't a single soldier in South Carolina. And in effect, what that did was left South Carolina defenseless, except that we did form our militias. Militias were formed in the backcountry for dangers from the Cherokees. They were formed primarily in the low country to prevent slave insurrections. So you had the aristocrats on the front. The British are saying, look, the French and Indian War darn near bankrupted us. If you want protection, you got to provide it yourself. Plus, we're so much in debt, we need to tax you folks for, we have been doing for you. So the stamp tax and then tolerable acts and all the other taxing acts were formed. Those taxes did really not affect the backcountry. The Stamp Act tax, you know, anytime a piece of paper or playing cards or whatever changed hands, it had to have a stamp on it. Well, the people in the backcountry, they didn't exchange paper. They couldn't read. This wasn't something that affected them, but it did affect the aristocrats on the coast who had 90,000 slaves. They wanted separation from England. Now, there were several items or things that the backcountry, they weren't too keen on the royal government either. I mean, they didn't like appointed justices of the peace and things of that nature. So they were a little bit divided, especially here in Lawrence County. In 1775, the Patriot government, which had formed a shadow government and actually even ran the royal governor into a warship in Charleston Harbor. That was in September of 1775. In a month or two after that, they sent a group of guys into the backcountry to talk about associating with the other states in opposition to the British government. These were Drayton, Tennant, and Hart. Drayton was a Charleston aristocrat. Tennant and Hart were either Presbyterian and or Baptist ministers. And they came throughout this area trying to get the populace to join with the aristocrats in opposing British rule. And half the places that group went to, they were very well received. The other half the places they went to, they just about got run out on a rail. So, you know, tensions are building. And it was just, you know, a conflicting time. Many authors say that half of the populace here in the 96th district was for the British remaining as king's men. The other half wanted independence. Other stories say that a third of the populace here wanted independence, a third wanted to stay with English subjects, and the other third just simply did not care. So it was very divided here. During the Revolutionary War, Loyalist members, Patrick Cunningham in particular, were elected to the provincial assembly. Lawrence County was electing Tories to the state government. Robert Cunningham, who was the most notorious British general, he was elected state senator from Lawrence County. And he was elected running against James Williams, who was the hero of Musgrove Mill. If you were a Tory and got arrested and went to trial in 96, chances are that Tory jury was going to find you innocent. And that happened. So very divided sentiments here in the backcountry. But everybody was totally unified in worried about what was happening with the Cherokees. That was the biggest concern, is the Cherokees going on the warpath, which they did in 1775. So that's kind of my stopping point for tonight. The forces that are building up, the tensions that were building up here in the backcountry and all along the coast of South Carolina, what happened in Lexington and Concord, shots were being fired. And starting next week, we're going to start discussing the Second Cherokee War, Cherokee War of 1776. and get into the nitty-gritty of what happened then with the battles.